Browsing the dark web is never safe, and a group of hackers would soon discover that some doors should never be opened. When they come across a website called the virtual crypts, what seemed like just another digital curiosity quickly turns into a nightmare. Live broadcasts of dark rituals, human sacrifices, and demonic summons flash on the screen, and the hackers discover, too late, that they are being watched and hunted. Now, they are the next victims of the mysterious figures controlling the crypts. But escape can be impossible when the danger lies within the network itself. Welcome to the channel where every story could be the last. Here we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories. If you like to feel that chill down your spine, subscribe now, activate the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next story could be yours. The discovery of the crypts. It all started as a joke. Mark, Dylan and Claire were longtime friends, united by their passion for technology and hacking. In my spare time, I like to explore the dark web, look for loopholes in systems, and try to find the internet's darkest secrets. For them, it was like a game, something they did to prove their skills and challenge each other. But what they would find that night, when accessing an encrypted forum, would change their lives forever. Mark was the most experienced of the group and, most of the time, led the investigations. He had an innate talent for breaking codes and accessing areas of the internet that most people didn't even know existed. Dylan, on the other hand, was the cryptography expert, managing to decipher even the most complex algorithms. Claire, the most practical of the trio, took care of digital security, ensuring that their forays were not tracked. One night, Mark found a link on a closed forum. The title was enigmatic, The Crypts. Below, a brief description read, "Only for those seeking the true unknown. Do not enter without being prepared." The warning didn't intimidate Mark, who just linked him with friends. They were always looking for something different, something that tested their limits, and this seemed like exactly the kind of challenge they wanted. "It looks like a game, or maybe something more interesting," Mark said with a sarcastic smile as he copied the link. Dylan rolled his eyes. "We're going to end up in one of those forum urban legends if we keep clicking on this stuff." "That's how we find the best things," Claire replied, already opening the site's source code to examine its security. When accessing the website, they were retrieved by a black page, without images, without graphics. Just a button in the center of the screen that said, "Enter the crypts." Claire took a quick look at the site structure. "I don't see anything suspicious here, at least not on the surface," she said, adjusting her glasses. "It seems to be another one of those Halloween pranks you find on the internet." "Let's go in, then," said Mark, already clicking the button without waiting for the others. The website screen has changed. A video began to play, showing a room lit only by candles. In the center, a stone altar with ancient symbols engraved on its surface. Around the altar, hooded people, wearing black robes, recited chants in an unknown language. The voices echoed low and low, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Mark, Dylan, and Claire sat silently, watching as the ritual unfolded on the screen. "That doesn't feel right," muttered Dylan, his eyes fixed on the screen. In the video, a figure was brought down the aisle. It was a man, with his hands tied and a blindfold over his eyes. He was clearly terrified, his body shaking as the chants around him increased in intensity. The camera focused on his face, showing his tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered something to himself, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a last plea for forgiveness. Suddenly, one of the hooded men seemingly wielded a shining ceremonial knife, and in one swift movement, the blade came down. Mark turned off the video immediately, his face pale and his hands trembling lightly. Dylan and Claire were in shock. Was this real? This can't be real, Claire whispered, without looking away from the screen, as if expecting something else to happen. Mark shook his head slowly. I don't know. But it felt real. What if it was? We need to find out more. Dylan looked at him with a descriptive expression. More? You want to continue after seeing this? Dude, we're talking about a live murder? Maybe it's just a trick. One of those fake videos to scare anyone who comes in. I've seen things like that before, Mark replied, trying to maintain his composure. But what if it isn't? If this is real, we could be witnessing something much bigger. Despite the obvious fear, curiosity spoke louder. The group decided to investigate further. They opened a navigation tab on the site and discovered that there were a series of rituals available to view, all with data and live broadcast times. These videos aren't old, Claire said, her hands shaking as she lightly brushed over the features. They're scheduled for the next few hours, and there's one that starts in 30 minutes. The clock on the website was counting down. 29 minutes and 57 seconds. If this is real, they're doing this stuff live. We have to watch, said Mark, more determined now, his mind buzzing with the thought of exporting something big. Dylan hesitated, but finally relented. If this is what it looks like, then we need to record it. If someone is dead, we have to do something. Claire, more skeptical, began setting up a screen recorder and other mechanisms to capture the video. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Before it was a casual exploration of a strange website, now, I felt they were witnesses to something dark and horrible. The minutes passed slowly, and the group remained in absolute silence, watching the timer tick down to 0. When the live video started, what appeared on the screen was even more disturbing than before. This time, the cameras showed a larger room with macabre symbols drawn on the walls. In the center, another victim was tied up, but something about this transmission was different. Mark saw that, in the bottom corner of the screen, there was a small counter that showed how many people were watching. There were hundreds of spectators. It was at this moment that Claire became familiar. My God, they're voting. Dylan looked at the screen and saw that she was right. A small dialogue box had appeared, asking viewers to choose between different ways to sacrifice a person on the altar. They were participating as if it were a game. And it was at that moment that the three realized that they weren't just looking. They were also being present. Voting and persecution. Mark, Dylan and Claire were frozen in horror as they watched the broadcast. The vote counter in the corner of the screen showed that the spectators were chosen as the next victim on the altar would be sacrificed. Every vote felt like a death sentence, and the count was rising quickly. The ritual seemed to be part of some kind of macabre game, but none of its own spectators determined the victim's fate. We have to get out of here. This is wrong. It's sick. Claire whispered, turning away from the screen, her hands shaking. Dylan found out immediately. We need to report this to someone. Police, FBI, someone has to see this. Marcos, however, hesitated. He was still processing what was happening, unable to look away from the screen. If we leave now, we'll lose the evidence. No one will believe us. We need to record as much as possible, find out who's behind this. But before he could decide his next step, the computer screen began to flicker. Suddenly, a new message appeared. You have been noticed. Now, you are also part of the crypts. The room was completely silent. Mark looked at the others, afraid to rely on his eyes. What does that mean? Dylan typed quickly on the keyboard, trying to close the website or turn off the computer, but nothing worked. The system was frozen. More messages managed to appear, one after another. You are being watched. There is no escape. The choice is no longer yours. That's when the live video cameras changed focus. The broadcast showed a new scene, a dark room, very similar to the one they were in. In the corner of the screen, a camera seemed focused on the entrance of an old, dimly lit building with a rusty iron door. Claire spoke up abruptly, confirming something familiar. This is our entrance. It's our building," she exclaimed, eyes wide. Mark quickly glanced at the screen and confirmed. They were being filmed. The broadcast now showed the facade of the building they were in, as if the people behind the crypts were outside, watching. Dylan, trying to remain calm, began to close the curtains and lock the door. This can't be happening, this isn't real. But the panic grew. Claire went to the window and looked down at the street below. The streetlights flickered irregularly, and an oppressive feeling that something was about to happen took over the room. There was no one visible on the street, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, another message appeared on the screen. Make your choices. The screen was split in two, and the live broadcast showed two paths. One showed what appeared to be the exit of the building, and the other, a staircase leading to the basement. The instructions were simple: the group should choose which path to follow, but with an implicit warning that both options carried deadly risks. "This is some kind of sick game," said Claire, with a trembling voice. "They want to make us choose, just like in the votes for sacrifices." Mark looked at Dylan, who was pale. "We have to get out of here. If we stay, they'll catch us." Dylan met him with a quick wave. He was no longer in survival mode, his mind working to find a solution. But at the same time, I knew I was dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than anything that had ever happened online. Mark, still in shock, began to think about the possibility of trying to game the system. What if this is a trap? Maybe if we choose the wrong path, they'll trap us for good. We have to be smart about this. Before he could make a decision, the lights in the building flickered, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor. The sound was distant, but it grew louder, closer. "Someone is coming," Dylan whispered, sensing the terror increasing. They couldn't wait any longer. With their hearts racing, Mark, Dylan and Claire decided to leave the apartment and try to escape. With the laptop still plugged in and the live feed showing their every move, they ran towards the exit. Upon reaching the door, Mark looked at the screen once again, trying to determine if heading out of the building was safe. "Let's try to exit down the street. We can't stay here," said Claire, opening the door with a shaking hand. They walked down the stairs of the building in a hurry, trying to make as little noise as possible. But the sound of the footsteps they heard before was now closer. Someone or something was upstairs, following them. It was as if they were being hunted. When I finally reached the building's entrance, the silence outside was disconcerting. There were no cars going, there were no people walking in the streets. It was as if the city was deserted, shrouded in oppressive darkness. The air was charged with a sense of imminent danger. Mark stopped for a second to observe the street, trying to understand what could be happening. It was then that he noticed a black car parked on the other side of the street, with its headlights off. He hadn't seen that car before, and now an ominous presence emanated from it. "I think we're being watched," said Mark, pointing to the car. Claire was having trouble breathing, but the ground was visible in her eyes. "We need to keep moving, we can't stop now." Dylan found out and they quickly walked down the street, trying to get away from the building. But the feeling that they were being persecuted did not leave them. And then, a new notification appeared on Mark's phone. "You cannot escape the crypts. All who enter remain." The warning was like a punch in the gut. They were in the middle of a macabre game, being collected by unknown forces. Every step they took, every movement, seemed to be carefully monitored. It was as if the site's creators themselves were playing games with them. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty streets again. This time it was clearer. They turned around, but there was no one in sight. The darkness seemed to hide something that was approaching. "Run!" Hug Mark, panic finally taking over. The group began to run desperately down the street, without a clear direction, just trying to get as far away from the building as possible. But, no matter how much it corresponded, the sound of the footsteps did not disappear. On the contrary, it got closer and closer. They turned a corner and looked back and saw something coming out of the shadows. It was a hooded figure with a white, expressionless mask. Their steps were slow but steady, as if they knew they would eventually catch up. Mark, Claire, and Dylan continued running, but the feeling of desperation grew. They were trapped in a game they didn't fully understand, hunted by something that was more than just a physical threat. They were being played against their own fear, their own sanity. As the night progressed, the question echoing in their minds was the same. How to escape something that had already been captured from the beginning? The invisible siege. Mark, Claire, and Dylan's breathing was out of control. Every step they took along the deserted street seemed to echo in the void, while the sound of heavy footsteps, coming from the hooded figure that followed them, did not cease. However it matched, the hooded figure's presence seemed unwavering, moving with a frightening calm, as if it knew their time was running out. "This can't be happening," Claire said, trying to remain calm as she looked back and saw the sinister figure approaching slowly, but without stopping. Dylan stopped for a moment, panting, leaning against a brick wall, hands on his knees. There has to be some logical explanation for this. Someone is manipulating everything. It's like we're in a game. Mark couldn't think straight anymore. His mind was racing, unable to process everything that was happening. What was that website? Who were those people? And why were they being hunted? "This is a nightmare," Mark muttered, panting. "And the only way out is to find what they want." Suddenly, Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket. He quickly got the device, and a new message appeared on the screen. "You are closer than you think. Only one of you can survive." Claire looked at the message over Mark's shoulder, and her face paled. What does that mean? Just one of us? That doesn't make sense." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Those words were more than a threat, they were a promise. Virtual Crypts wasn't just a macabre observation game, there was something bigger at stake. They were not just spectators. They were part of a ritual, part of a sacrifice. As he thought this, the hooded figure continued to approach, each step closer. It was not possible to hear his breathing, nor see his face under the hood. But his eyes glowed with increasing intensity, as if he was amused by their terror. Mark looked at his friends. He knew the decision must be brutal, but there was no choice. They will first find a way out, and quickly. "We have to go somewhere," said Mark, pointing to an old abandoned store on the corner of the street. "Over there. It might be our only chance to hide and try to figure out what to do." Without thinking twice, the group ran to the store. The door was unlocked, and they hurried inside, closing it behind them. The inside of the store was covered in dust, with shelves falling apart and old merchandise lying on the floor. It was as if no one had been in there for years. "We're safe, for now," Claire said, looking around suspiciously. Dylan began to pace the place, his mind searching for answers. "That doesn't make sense. They're playing us, manipulating our every move. We need a way to turn the tables on them." Mark couldn't take his eyes off the door. He knew that hooded figure was out there, waiting, watching. It doesn't matter how long they try to hide, eventually, they will be found. It was then that Claire found something. At the back of the store, a small door led to a storage room. And, in the middle of the warehouse, something that looked like an old wooden table, covered in strange symbols. This seems like part of the ritual," Claire whispered, her fingers trembling as she pointed to the symbols. Dylan moved, frowning as he examined the designs on the wood. "They are the same symbols we saw on the website. The crypts are linked to this in some way. But what do they want from us?" Mark, now more confused than ever, walked over to the table and touched the symbols engraved on it. As he did so, a strange feeling ran through his body, as if something had been triggered. The table began to vibrate slightly, and a hidden compartment opened, revealing a small, old notebook covered in dust. This must have answers," said Mark, taking the notebook with shaking hands. They opened the notebook and found the yellowed pages reading. The writings were disjointed, full of scribbles and strange symbols, but some passages were clear enough to be understood. "The chosen are brought to the virtual crypts. The ritual requires sacrifices. Only one can leave." Those words made Mark's heart stop. It was true. They were involved in a game of life and death, and only one of them managed to survive. The crypts were more than a simple transmission of sacrifices, they were part of an ancient ritual, where participants' lives were offered in exchange for something they did not yet fully understand. This can't be right," Claire said, closing the notebook tightly. "We're not going to sacrifice ourselves. This is crazy." Dylan looked at her, his eyes dark. "What if we have no choice, Claire? What if one of us has to do this for the others to make it out alive?" The tension was not palpable. They knew something terrible was approaching, something terrible. The hooded figure outside wasn't just hunting them for sport, it was part of a ritual, and its presence was the sign that the end was approaching. Suddenly, Mark's phone vibrated again. He took it with shaking hands, not wanting to see the message, but knowing he needed it. "The choice is yours, Mark. Sacrifice or be sacrificed." Mark felt his stomach drop. He knew he had been chosen. But what did this happen? Would he have to choose who of the three would survive? How could I do that? Panic began to rise in his chest. Dylan, seeing the expression on Mark's face, moved. "Mark, what happened?" Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the store. The hooded figure had entered. "They're here," Claire whispered, looking around, trying to find a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The hooded figure slowly entered the warehouse, its presence overwhelming, the white, expressionless mask reflecting the dim light. She stopped a few feet away, heading directly toward the group. Mark felt the weight of the notebook in his hands. The crypts were waiting. The ritual of sacrifices. He would have to choose, or they would all die. The hooded figure raised his hand, and the clock began to count again. Time was running out. Choose, the cold, distorted voice echoed through the warehouse. Or you will all be taken. The final sacrifice. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating. The hooded figure stood there, motionless but with an overwhelming presence, as if it controlled every part of the room. His eyes, hidden by the expressionless white mask, explicitly fixed on Mark. The clock on Mark's phone continued to tick, each second echoing in his mind like a drumbeat, marking the outcome. Choice. The word resonated in Mark's head, but he couldn't produce what was happening. His heart was beating so fast that he felt like he was going to die at any moment. How could he choose? How could he, Dylan or Claire, escape this nightmare without sacrificing someone? Each of them had the same question on their mind: who would survive? "Mark, what are we going to do?" said Claire, her voice shaking with fear. Dylan looked at Mark, waiting for a response, but deep down, he already knew what that message meant. He sees the look of desperation in Mark's eyes. "That's not fair, how can they choose us?" Mark remained silent, struggling to find a way out that didn't involve the death of one of his friends. But the more he planned, the more the terror of the situation overwhelmed him. The hooded figure wasn't just a physical threat, it was a symbol of something much deeper, something that controlled the rules of the game, the lives that were at stake. You cannot escape. The sacrificial ritual requires it. The figure took a step forward, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Mark knew time was running out. If I didn't choose the logo, they would all be taken away. But how could he live with that decision? How could he choose which of his friends would be sacrificed? Suddenly, Claire took a step forward, breathing hard but determined. "If someone has to do this, then I will," she said, her voice full of fear but also of desperate courage. "We can't go on like this. Maybe if I go, you two can survive." Mark shook his head, horrified. "No, Claire. I won't let you do that. We can't sacrifice you." Dylan, despite being terrified, also stepped forward. "Claire, no. That's not fair. We don't know what will happen if one of us turns ourselves in. What if this is just another trap?" But the hooded figure silently, waiting. Mark felt an indescribable pressure in his mind, as if he was being asked to make a decision he could not bear. It was as if the crypts knew he was hesitating, playing on his fear and guilt. Then, a mask of the hooded figure flashed with a cold and intense light, and a new message appeared on Mark's phone. "She has made her choice. The ritual will be complete. Leave now or all will perish." Mark's heart stopped for a second. Claire had really decided to sacrifice herself. She had accepted what seemed to be the only path of survival for others. But Mark couldn't accept it. He moved towards her, holding her shoulders. "Claire, no. This can't be the end. Let's find another way." But she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mark, please, we have to end this. I don't want you two to die because of me." Dylan looked at the scene, unable to speak. He knew Claire was trying to be aggressive, but the horror of the situation was too overwhelming. How did they get to this point? The hooded figure took another step forward, extending his hand, as if waiting for Claire to accept her fate. Mark felt the despair inside him. He wanted to fight, he wanted to find a way to save everyone, but he knew time was running out. The clock continued to tick. If they didn't do something now, they would all be taken away. It was then that Claire, trembling with fear, reached out towards the hooded figure. She knew there was no longer any way to escape. If she wasn't delivered, the game would continue, and they would all be destroyed. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. Mark's phone vibrated again, but this time, the message was different. Sacrifice interrupted. The next choice will be yours. Before Mark could react, the hooded figure slipped into the shadows, and the clock on the phone reset. The environment around them began to change, as if the room was disintegrating. The walls dissolved into mist, and the feeling of oppression that surrounded them began to disappear. Mark looked back, confused. Claire and Dylan were also trying to understand what was going on. Everything was falling apart around them, as if the world of the crypts was falling apart. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were back at Mark's apartment, as if they had never left there. The heavy breathing of the three was the only thing that could be heard in the room. There were no more hooded figures, no more rituals or sacrifices. Mark's computer was shut down, and the virtual crypts page was completely gone. Is this over?" asked Dylan, looking around, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. Claire, still shaking, hugged herself. I don't know. It feels like we've been freed. But something still wasn't right. Mark feels it. They narrowly escaped, but the feeling that they were gifts would never leave him. The virtual crypts may be gone, but what they witnessed, the terror and despair, would remain with them forever. Mark moved away from the computer, hoping everything had gone back to normal. He turned the machine on again, and the screen flashed. Everything seemed to be normal. No sign of the crypts. No messages. No rituals. But then, something caught his attention. In the corner of the screen, a small icon blinked. It was a notification, a single unread message. When he clicked, a window appeared. The message said, "You never completely leave. Did you like this story? I left another scary story here on the card. Click on it. Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Share your story in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of your story together."